Tonight I'm going to talk to you not too long about a subject that I'm very interested in, and maybe you will be more so at the end of this talk. And some of you may have heard something about this in the past, which is blue-green algae and what causes them. We really haven't got into that in the past. We talked a little bit about some things that happened a couple of years ago, but I wanted to spend more time tonight talking about what causes them and why we are having problems with them, and then something about what we can do to address the problem. So there are things that you can do. So here's a bunch of things that I'd like to go over.
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry. I should. Rebecca tells me I should introduce myself. I'm Bob Lynch, and I'm a faculty member at the University of Oklahoma. And Rebecca, and I've worked up here for, how long, Rebecca, now? 17 years. So it's been a while. And, it's nice to get away from Oklahoma City. So here's what I'm going to try to cover. A lot of topics, but most of these won't spend too much time going over. So a little bit about what blue-green algae are, where they come from, why did they grow, why do we worry about them, how much did we have when we had a problem a couple of years ago, and are there things that you can do to address the situation. But first thing I should ask, I thought, is being a professor, I'm always sure that I know what people want to hear about, but my students regularly tell me that that's not what they want to hear about, but that's too bad for them. They just have to listen to what I want to say, but you guys don't. So if there's anything that you all want to hear, or topic related to this, something that I might not have thought about, here's your chance. Or later on, if you think of something, if there's anything that jumps in your mind that you would like to hear about this topic. I'll get there indirectly, but I'll make sure I mention that. Anything else? Okay, well, let me jump into this, and we'll go through this pretty quick. If you have any questions while I'm talking, please feel free to just go ahead and ask. You don't need to wait. Don't need to raise your hand or anything like that. My students don't raise their hands. That's gone out the door. So the first thing is what are they? One, they're a very diverse group of organisms. Some of them are very small, some are somewhat bigger. But the ones that we worry about the most are pretty small. These are microscopic organisms. So you need a microscope to really identify them. Most of them are blue-green in color. That makes sense, but some are different colors. They occur around the world. So any aquatic environment you go to, anywhere in the world, you'll find these things. Some live on dirt. Some live on trees. Some, if you have a moldy home, you probably have blue-green algae growing in your home. So they can grow really anywhere. They're somewhat like plants, and they're somewhat like bacteria. So they're kind of an in-between stage between those two. So they're often called cyanobacteria. But they're the same thing whether you call them, no matter what you call them. So I got a few pictures I'll run through pretty quickly to show you what they look like. And you can see the scale here, so 20 micrometers scale. So a micrometer is a thousandth of a millimeter. So if you had 50 of those in a row, 50 of those little lines in a row, you'd have a millimeter. So these are pretty small organisms. So these are the typical kind of blue-green algae that you would see in lakes. This one's called microcystis, and this is actually one of the ones that Grand Lake had problems with a couple of years ago. So a pretty common one, and one of the kind of bad actors in the blue-green algae group of organisms. So I can't tell you that, and I don't expect you to sit in rapt attention to how beautiful are these things, like you might with butterflies or something. They're not the world's most beautiful creatures, but to me, very interesting to look at nonetheless. So that's actually a collection. That's actually a water sample from Grand Lake from a couple of years ago. So looking at a lower magnification. This is another one. It's called Anabina. This is also one of the ones that was a problem a couple of years ago in Grand Lake. So the question came about where do these things come from? Blue-green algae are among the world's oldest organisms. There are fossils that are a few billion years old. The earliest organisms for which we have fossil records are blue-green algae. So they've been around for a long time. So they're a very normal part of the environment. That's a picture of a bigger one. It's called a stromatolite. You can actually carve them and make, I don't know, you might not call that art. I'm not sure that I'll call that art either, but you can carve it and decide if you think that's pretty or not. So what makes them grow? This gets to the question a little bit we had from Grove. They're just like any other plant, and the most important regard is that they need nutrients to grow. So they'll grow very, very rapidly, and when they grow very rapidly, we call that a bloom. So when there are lots of nutrients present, they grow. So just like your lawn, if you give your lawn lots of nutrients, fertilizer, it grows. If you dump a lot of fertilizer in your lakes, algae grow. So they behave identical. So one of the sources of nutrients in Grand Lake and in many of the lakes in eastern Oklahoma is runoff from poultry operations. So poultry operations contain nitrogen, phosphorus, and the blue-green algae or any other plant growing there. That's great food. They're very happy to have it. So they're no different than any other kind of plant. So of all the nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen are the most important ones. And there's actually a ratio between those that will kind of shift the population of algae towards blue-green algae, and we'll look at that more in a minute. So this is a picture that I took. I think you can see that pretty well. This is from Lake Overholser in Oklahoma City, and that light kind of limey green surface algae you see there is microcystis. And so this is what we see when we get the right amount of nitrogen and phosphorus there in the right ratios.
Which ones can you point?
Kind of floating one. I really can't point at it. Just to the above the pipe, you can see some kind of green streak. The water's pretty green anyway, but that's pretty typical color that you see with blue-green algae. And they often float. So how much nutrient is too much? So generally speaking, when phosphorus levels are above about 0.05 milligrams per liter, which is about 50 parts per billion, we consider that to be too much phosphorus. And optimal is something less than 0.02. So if you have really low levels of phosphorus, you won't have much of an algae problem. That's probably an unrealistic number to have, but 0.05 is what we'd like to see. For nitrogen, something less than a milligram per liter or 1 part per million is what we would hope for. The last bullet there is about the ratio. So there's a ratio between nitrogen and phosphorus. When that gets below 15, and we'll see some numbers here in a minute, then that will favor the growth of blue-green algae. They'll tend to grow when that happens. So a little bit more about phosphorus. Phosphorus in most aquatic environments is the limiting nutrient. It's much less abundant than nitrogen. And so if you want to control algae growth, the best way to do it is to try to control the amount of phosphorus that gets into the lake. So that should really be the focus in most cases. So where do nutrients come from? They can come from a variety of sources. So point sources, we can have wastewater treatment facilities. And so in the Grand Lake watershed and in any watershed in any state, there are a number of municipal sewage plants. And municipal sewage plants treat the waste to a certain level, and then they discharge that waste into surface water. And that water contains lots of nutrients, a lot of phosphorus and a lot of nitrogen. Any other permitted facilities, food production facilities, will have nutrients in there. So we don't do much to control those. So those would be the main point sources of pollution. And non-point sources are runoff sources, septic tanks. So around Grand Lake, there's some number of septic tanks. Most all of those leach into Grand Lake, and those contain lots of nutrients. So to the algae, that's free food. Urban runoff, yards, golf courses, farm runoff, factory runoff, basically any place where nitrogen and phosphorus come from. So this, if you look at this list, it kind of presents the daunting problem that we face, that there are so many sources of nutrients So controlling it is not a question of just picking on that person or that person. It has to be a more integrated approach to try to reduce this. So again, if we look at the Grand Lake watershed, so we've got 10,000 some odd square miles of watershed. And so located on all those tributaries are many places that directly discharge wastewater into the watershed. So every municipality, including Miami, that's in that watershed, takes their sewage, treats it, and dumps it into a river. And those all flow into Grand Lake, and those are all very full of nutrients. And of course, then there's all the farming and everything else that goes on there as well will contribute to it. So there are actually some values for how much phosphorus is going into the lake. The most recent ones I found were from 2007.
Dr.
Probably,
Lynch,
yes, sir.
if you could go back to that map.
Go back to the map. Okay.
Yeah, the previous map is what rivers are those that go into Grand Lake?
Okay. The main one is the upper left is the Neosho. And then the quadrant to the upper right would be Spring River. And then below that, the kind of purplish would be Elk River. And then the other part are smaller tributaries, Big Cabin Creek and such, closer to the lake. But the majority of the watershed is the Neosho.
Thank you.
So again, these are values for how much phosphorus is going into the lake. And so these are kind of abstract figures that are hard to interpret, but it gives you an idea for planning purposes as to how much is coming in. Because one thing we can do for a lake like Grand Lake is to calculate how much phosphorus that lake is capable of handling before it has problems. So we can see there's some 3,500 kilograms per day of phosphorus going into the lake. And I don't know offhand, but I'll be willing to take a bet with anyone that we would calculate that as being too much. And if you're putting that much phosphorus in the lake, you're bound to have problems with algae. So whether that's 10 times too high or 3 times, I don't know, but I bet you it's too much. So what happens to phosphorus when it gets in the lake? It causes a lot of the organisms to become more abundant. This starts with the algae. So the algae grow. Some organisms eat the algae, they grow. Other organisms eat the fish, and moves up the food chain. And so lakes generally just become more rich. After these organisms die, they settle down to the bottom of the lakes. They take the phosphorus with them. So in the short term, that can be a good thing. So the phosphorus will tend to build up into sediments and kind of disappear from the lake. Unfortunately, as lakes age, the chemistry of the lake changes near the bottom. And then the phosphorus that's been accumulating in the bottom will start coming back out. So in older lakes, middle-aged lakes, you start seeing the phosphorus actually come back out of the lake. So we know in Grand Lake, for example, that parts of it at the bottom of the lake during the summer, there's no oxygen near the sediments. And under those conditions, the phosphorus is going to start coming back out. This is a very natural phenomenon that happens. So the nutrients that have been trapped there for decades are now starting to come back out. So a picture of what that looks like, you can see the upper left, we've got phosphorus, nitrate, sediment. These things are flowing into the lake. And then you can see the little group of organisms there at the top. They're starting to grow. They'll settle down to the bottom. The red arrow represents that they will start coming out. You probably can't read the verbiage there on the left. So a couple of things you see as lakes become enriched. One, the phosphorus comes out, and very importantly, the bottom parts of lakes tend to lose their oxygen. So the habitat for fish is less good. Other things can happen. More mercury can become more mobile in the environment under those conditions. So that's probably not something we can do anything much about. So we can classify lakes according to the amount of phosphorus that's there. And this is often the way we group our lakes and label them. So we call this the trophic status of the lake. So it's basically a measurement of how much is food there. So the four main ways that that is done, you can see the trophic status there on the left and the names under there, kind of long names. At the top one, oligotrophic, means that there's not many nutrients there, very clean, and this is what we tend to have with new lakes. And as we move down the list, this is a situation where nutrients are starting to build up. The lakes become what are called eutrophic or hyper-eutrophic. They're very productive. There's lots of nutrients. And under these conditions, lakes will tend to have problems with algae. So we don't want our lakes to be eutrophic or hyper-eutrophic. That's a bad thing. That means we're adding too many nutrients to them. So keep those names in mind. So again, it just repeats that. So these lakes, hyper-eutrophic and eutrophic lakes, are likely to have problems with algae, and if the ratio of those nutrients are right, then that algae will tend to be blue-green algae. So that's some data from the Water Resources Board. A couple of years, they have a program where they look at lakes. They take some samples and try to classify their trophic status. So you can see they've taken 71 lakes and then classified them based on the amount of phosphorus there as to their trophic state. So the important part of that is you can see we have very few lakes that are called oligotrophic. So we have very few lakes that are low in nutrients. On the other hand, about 68% of the lakes they tested are considered eutrophic or hyper-eutrophic. So about 70% of our lakes are likely to have algae problems based on this. That's just basic biology of nutrients. So having 68% that are nutrient enriched is bad, but it's a call to action. It tells us we need to do something to try to reduce the amount of nutrients that are going into them. So that study, Grand Lake was classified as eutrophic. So it's classified based on the amount of phosphorus there is likely going to have a problem with algae. So I mentioned these numbers. I wanted to show you these again, just so if the slide looks familiar, it's because you just saw it. But keep in mind this value of 0.05 for phosphorus and 1.0 for nitrogen is kind of the standard that we would hope our lakes would be in. So I'm going to show you some data from Grand Lake from 2011. So we got 5 sites from Grand Lake there on the left. So you can see the amount of nitrogen that was in the lake. So if we use 1 as kind of our guiding principle, we want it to be less than 1. At Horse Creek, the amount of total nitrogen was almost 23. So it's about 23 times higher than we would like. So this is phenomenally enriched. Phosphorus, we would like it to be less than 0.05, and it's Horse Creek was 2.7. So again, much higher than we would like. And then that ratio I talked about, we like that ratio to be 15 or greater. And the ratio to not have blue-green algae was less than 15, we tend to get blue-green algae. So that ratio was much lower. So that's telling us there's lots of nutrients there. They're in the right ratio to produce a bloom of blue-green algae. And guess what happened? We had a massive bloom of blue-green algae. But if you'd show anybody this data had never seen Grand Lake, they'd say, you're going to have a problem. These are phenomenally high nutrient values, and they're in the right ratio. The bottom numbers are 3 wastewater treatment facilities. I found some data for them. So this is the amount of phosphorus that comes out in their effluent. So you can see about 2.5 parts per million, 5, and 1.6. So compare those to the numbers above, and what it says is that basically the water quality in Grand Lake that summer in terms of phosphorus was equivalent to a sewage discharge. So if you've ever seen what happens if you pond up a sewage discharge, it turns really green. That's one way we treat sewage, is put in ponds and treat. So I mean, this was equivalent to sewage. So not surprising we had a bloom. So this number should alarm all of us. Actually, when I saw these numbers, I didn't believe them. First time I saw it, this must be a mistake, and I saw somebody else's numbers. Taken different person, different everything, and they were the same. So those are good numbers. So what can we conclude about this? Well, the nutrient levels in Grand Lake were really high. And based on those numbers, we would call the lake hypereutrophic. The ratio was right for blue-green algae, and basically it says we have a serious problem in Grand Lake and a lot of other lakes. If Grand Lake looks like that again, the bloom will be repeated. So you can take my guarantee on that. The nutrient levels are much lower right now. They spiked that summer. If they get to that level again, we will have a big bloom again. It will definitely happen. So the problem's going to get worse unless we do something to fix it. The nutrients are going to keep flowing into the lake. They're going to keep building up. We're not stopping any of this. They're just accumulating. So if you keep dumping stuff, eventually you get too much. So why do we care about these things? So generally these things are not a problem. They occur all over the world. Any water sample you look at is going to have blue-green algae. Some are used as food supplements. I don't know if you can see this. This is spirulina. You can buy this at the health food store. This is a kind of blue-green algae that's farmed. People eat it. Very high in protein, very good for you. But this is not the same one that's in Grand Lake. So blue-green algae are not created equal, like poison ivy and tulips. They're both plants and they grow. One you don't want to touch, the other one's okay. So they're not all bad. But under certain conditions that I've gone over, these things can bloom. And so why we care about that, you can see from the numbered bullets, is some species contain very strong toxins. Some of them have chemicals in their cell membranes that can cause dermatitis or rash. It's often called swimmer's itch. If you get too much of any algae in a lake, you're likely to have a problem with big fluctuations in the amount of oxygen that's in the lake. And so these can easily cause fish kills. We'll look a little bit more at the toxins. So here's some, in the discussions a couple of years ago, a lot of things came up, and there were some meetings here, there were some meetings at the state capitol that I went to, and so there are a lot of opinions that were expressed about the situation. So here's the one I expressed. I'll claim the first one because I believe it. So it's potentially a serious public health issue. There were people who said, no big deal, bunch of nobody's ever gotten sick, it's a bunch of tree huggers pointing stuff out that doesn't matter. There were issues brought up that advisories hurt the economy. Absolutely. Tell people they can't go to the lake or shouldn't go to the lake, that's going to hurt the economy. No doubt about it. It was brought up at a meeting I went to that going to the lake is inherently risky. If you go to the lake, you're taking risks, and that's the way it is, and this is just another one of those risks, and the people that go there ought to just be willing to handle this kind of nominal risk. So let's look at some of the risks. So there's been a lot of work that's gone on for a few decades to try to identify some of the toxins associated with blue-green algae. And that work continues to find new ones, but here's kind of a standard list that is used, although again, it's a partial list, as you can see. So we break those toxins down into different categories. So we have nerve toxins or neurotoxins, liver toxins or hepatotoxins, dermatoxins, things that make your skin itch, and general cell toxins are ones that kind of wherever they hit, they cause problems. And irritants are ones that if you inhale them, they'll irritate your lungs and can cause skin rash as well. So we've got these named. We know what they look like. The chemistry is well known. So these are, you can buy these from a laboratory if you want to buy a little bottle of them. Antitoxin, if you try to buy one, if you try to order some, the next person knocking on your door will be the FBI, wondering why you want this and what you're going to do with it. So it's classified as a biological warfare agent. Here are the same toxins, but the organisms that produce it. And I'm not going to be a quiz to ask you to pronounce these names because there are some little tongue twisters there. But the point of this slide is to show you that there are a number of organisms that can produce these compounds. So we know what they are. We don't always know why they produce toxin at particular times, but we can measure in a laboratory that these things do produce these particular toxins. So how poisonous are they? I've got some quick table there just talking about two of them. So the top two are microcystin and cylindrospermopsin. So these are ones that are produced by algae. We found these in Oklahoma. We've measured these. Measured the organisms, and we've actually measured the toxin. I've measured these in my lab. And so the values there, we can see the top two are from the algae. The ones below there are from different things. So nicotine, copperhead venom, king cobra venom, diamondback rattlesnake venom, and botulinum toxin. It comes from botulism, which comes from improperly cooked foods, or if you want wrinkle treatment, you can have this toxin injected into your skin. It paralyzes your nerves, does a real good job of that. Unfortunately, if you eat it, it also paralyzes your nerves and you die. So with these numbers, the smaller the number, the worse it is. And so this is kind of a crude estimate of the amount that it would take to kill a person that weighed 220 pounds. And so you can see for microcystin, it would take about 5 to 10 milligrams, take quite a bit more of cylindrospermopsin. But if we compare those to the others, we can see that, again, less is worse. We can see that microcystin is quite a bit worse than copperhead venom, quite a bit worse than cobra venom, quite a bit worse than diamond rattlesnake venom. So when I hear people say these toxins really aren't poisonous, really, it's about 20 times more potent than cobra venom. I'd call that fairly poisonous in my mind. So these are things that, this is not me making up some numbers, although I've manipulated these sums. So these are based on laboratory studies where people have gone to the labs and worked with rats and rabbits and so forth and have figured out how toxic these things are. So these things are really potentially very toxic. So quickly, I'm going to go over some of the evidence we have for toxicity associated with them. And we've got three basic kinds of evidence. We have reports of people from lakes, and we've got studies, epidemiological studies, where you look at populations. And then we've got a couple of controlled studies. So I'll go through these pretty quick. So there have been a number of reports going back over 100 years where people have reported that they went to a lake, it was green, they played all day, and when they got home, people got really sick. Or their dog died. That's happened many times. So if you play around the water, your dog drinks it. So these are pretty common. They're well documented. There's a large number of these reports. And so it's pretty good evidence that this happens, although this is not what we would call a scientific studies. Here the kind of results that are outcomes that people report. So a lot of hay fever-like symptoms, rashes, diarrhea, vomiting, abdominal pain. Number of animals have died. So if you go up to OSU, you can get a nice brochure saying if your pond turns green, don't let your cows drink out of it because it'll kill them. We don't have anything like that for people. But we have it for cows. So let's see who we value most, cows or people. So these are recreational exposures. So a couple of studies I'll just go over quickly. There was an incident in Wisconsin some years back, 10 years back, where some teenagers went to a golf course. Golf course ponds tend to get really green. There's a lot of nutrients that run into them. And these youngsters went swimming. A couple of them, 3 of them got a little bit sick. 2 of them, apparently by their reports, were underwater for some time. 1 got diarrhea and abdominal pain. The other got nausea, vomiting, and progressed to shock, seizure, and heart failure. So he died. And this person had acute heart damage. Didn't seem to have any evidence of other exposures. And this anatoxin was one of those toxins I mentioned. This was found in his blood and stool. So there's pretty good evidence that this young person died from that swim. Although I would still call this a story, but pretty good evidence. Been lots of reports of animal deaths around the country, and in Oklahoma it has not been uncommon. And for dogs to go down and drink the water and die within a day. Pretty common. Epi studies, where we look at population. There haven't been many of these because they're hard to do because you got to set them up beforehand. So it's difficult to know when these things are going to happen. So we can't get a crystal ball. No one will pay you to get a crystal ball. So we kind of have to guess, and that's hard to do. So typically what we do is we interview people after they go to the lake, and then we try to quantify the amount of cyanobacteria or blue-green algae that might be there, measure the toxins, how much algae was there. So there's been a couple of studies where they've done this, and one study they looked at about 3,000 visitors in the U.S. and Australia, and they asked them about symptoms if they went to a lake. So when there were lakes that had a lot of blue-green algae that people went in them, were much more likely to report a symptom or much more likely to report respiratory symptoms if there was a lot of algae there. So about twice as likely. That's what odds ratio 2 means, you're about twice as likely. So the toxin levels are pretty low, which indicates that it doesn't take much of this to make you sick. Similar study, same guy as actually one of the other ones. He looked at about 300 people, asked them the same sort of things, and he looked at the amount of time that they were there, the amount of algae that was there, and basically found that if you're exposed to more than a certain number of cells, that you were likely to get sick. And so from these types of values, the World Health Organization developed some guidelines saying, we have an idea if you get exposed to more than about this kind of algae, you're likely to get ill. And that's where the guidelines that have been used come from. There's one controlled study I'll mention, same fellow in Australia, where he took patches with the bacteria and applied it to people's skins and found that about 20% of people developed a rash. And so that seems to be a fairly consistent reading with other studies that when people go swim in the lake, about 20% of people get sick. So there seems to be some susceptibility that some people have and other people don't have. But that's the way life kind of is in general, that some people are more sensitive than others. But that's a pretty good hunk of the population, 20%. So what can we conclude about recreational risk? It's high. The risk is high when toxins are present. So there are high levels of toxin. This really does represent a health risk. There's a risk even when toxins aren't very high. So about 20-30% of people get symptoms even without many toxins. Again, this probably represents some general level of sensitivity in the population. So if you go, you just got to hope you're not the sensitive one. Maybe you are, maybe you're not. So a question comes up of, do we know enough to do this sort of thing? This is pretty controversial everywhere about putting signs up at lakes, advising people not to swim, closing beaches. How do we tell people? What do we tell people? And there's a lot of opinions out there about this. So there are some people who think that swimming is inherently dangerous, and if you go, you're kind of taking a risk, and you've got to be smart about things, and we shouldn't tell people. And there are other people who think that if the lake is bad, we've got to close the lake. Tell people, don't go swimming. Absolutely. So there's a range of opinions on there. Probably the best answer is somewhere in the middle of that. So how much did we have in Grand Lake during the summer of 2011? We had a lot. So we had lots of different kinds basically found in Oklahoma during that summer. So that summer of 2011 was kind of a spectacular year for algae. And some of these levels were really, really high. So this is a picture from Grand Lake. I'm not sure how well that shows up to you in Grove, but you can see the kind of green swirls in the lake. And so this is a pretty pronounced bloom of blue-green algae. Some of these things float, like microcystis, when I showed you, they actually float and they kind of build up on the surface. Some of them don't float, they're kind of more in the water, so the water will just get kind of a greenish tint. These tend to be more of a problem because it's windy here and they'll tend to build up. And they'll build up along the shoreline, and that's where kids play in the shoreline and dogs go drink out of the shoreline. So that's particularly worrisome. So here are the guidelines I mentioned. So this is the ones the World Health Organization uses. So they consider anything less than 20,000 cells per milliliter as a low risk. So if it's above 20,000, their advice is you should tell people there's a potential risk there, use it at your own risk, but at least inform people. Up to 100,000 risk, 100,000 cells per milliliter, they characterize as a moderate risk. and then they recommend restricting beach use at that point, trying to discourage people from getting in them. And then higher levels, when you see the scum start to build up, they really recommend closing beaches, just keeping people out at that point. So these are guidelines. These are not laws. Simply advice to give people that when the situation gets to this level, you should be informed and take action to. So here's what we found at Grand Lake. So keep these numbers in mind, 200,000 and 100,000, and we'll look at some different lakes. So here's Grand Lake. So microcystis was, again, one of the ones we saw there, and it's the most common producer of toxin. It's really the worst one we tend to see. So there was over 200,000 cells per milliliter of this one. So it's quite a bit above any sort of 10,000. You can argue about 20,000, 50,000. This is well above 200,000. Eufaula, you can see a couple of different organisms there that were in the 50s and the 30s. Fort Gibson, 50s and 90s. Keystone had over 2 million cells per milliliter. Way, way past the level where anyone should have any concern about, is this really a problem? At 2 million, this is a serious issue. Overholser, that picture was taken, had over 1 million. A few others, Waurika, 670,000. Hefner, 264,000. Lake Texoma had several genera that were pretty high. And you can add these up, really, to come up with a better idea of cumulative risk. So we add those two together, we're well over 200,000. You can see 10 killer. Ooligo was very low. So that's good news. Ooligo doesn't have much nutrients and it doesn't have much algae. So they weren't all high. So there are some standards for the toxins, not just the number of organisms there. So in some countries, there's actually a drinking water standard. It probably will be here fairly soon. For swimming areas, it's recommended that if the toxin, the microcystin, that particular toxin is above 20, that there's some risk for adverse effects. The drinking water standard or suggested one for another toxin, swimmers spermaceti. Again, the last bullet's pretty important. There aren't any U.S. standards for these. Within 10 years, there will be standards. So they're working on it. Getting standards in place takes a long time. It's a slow process.
Are they working on it?
Yep, they're working on it.
Are you involved?
Nope. So this will take a long time. Environmental standards are hard to get past. So keep this number 20 in mind that you see there. So here's the amount of microcystin, that one that we recommend nothing more than 20 per human contact. So here's that particular toxin measured in Grand Lake in 2011. And so you can see at Duck Creek, took a couple kind of samples. We took a grab sample of the water, and then we towed some water up, which would be kind of like what we would expect when it would accumulate. And so you can see that some of those values are really quite high. So 20 is the standard. 358 is a pretty high above that. See Horse Creek. So these values were certainly high enough to recommend that people not get in the water. So the rest of the world would say, it's too high, don't get in the water. It's like that. You're likely to get sick. Doesn't mean you're going to, just means you're likely to. There's a picture from Grand Lake. So you can start to see around the coves. See some little green there where it's starting to pile up. Again, those are kind of the problem areas because that's where kids tend to play. So this whole notion of advising people or cautioning people is not so much meant for adults as for children who tend to swallow a lot more water. You may go out and wade, but you know what your kids do. They roll in it and they inhale it and get it in their eyes and everywhere else. So they're the ones who are really going to get exposed. So they need more protection. So just some conclusions and let me move on to what we can do about this. So my conclusion is that these things are a serious potential threat. We have a problem in Oklahoma. we don't do something about it, it's just going to get worse. It's going to get worse every year until we start trying to address it. If we want to live with it, that's okay. That can be our choice. At certain times of the year is our lake. We just won't be able to go swimming in. If we want that to be our choice, that's okay. I don't think that's the best choice. The answer is no, there's not. Probably two things. One is political will, and two is state agencies do not have budgets for this. They had scarce to little resources to devote for this, and all those have been cut. So there is not money at state agencies to address this. Yeah, it would have to be federal funds. There aren't state. These things take federal. One of the problems is you take the Grand Lake watershed. It's part in Missouri, part in Arkansas, part in Kansas, part in Oklahoma. So those are even two different EPA regions. So you're trying to coordinate that. That has to be federal action. The states get along pretty well, but it's probably illegal for me to spend Oklahoma money in Kansas. It's probably against the law. So Kansas probably can't spend money in Oklahoma. So it takes federal action. It takes a fair amount of money to do that. So let me show you what we can do about this. So simple. The solution really to the problem is simple. Just reduce the amount of nutrients in our lakes. So one thing good we have here is we don't have any natural lakes. So where Laurel comes from, they have lakes that are natural, and the water changes out about once every 10 years. Our lakes change out about once a month. So the water comes in, it flows out, we get new water all the time. So if you get clean water coming in, you can fix the problem pretty quick. So that's good news. But we got to reduce that. So how can we reduce it? Well, first thing we need to look at the scale of the problem. Right now, we do little to nothing to control nutrient input into our state waters. So an example of that is in Oklahoma, we treat about more than 300 million gallons of sewage per day. We dump that back into rivers, and we do not remove the nitrogen or phosphorus. Zero. There's one plant in Oklahoma that does. That's at Tahlequah, because it discharges right into the Illinois River right above Lake Timko. That is the only plant in the state that has a permit requirement to remove phosphorus. So no city removes nutrients from it. So expensive proposition. This is not cheap. This is not a cheap proposition. So we could start with that. So we don't address it from our point sources in municipalities. We don't address it from nutrient runoff from municipalities. So urban areas are some of the biggest contributors to nutrient pollution. So runoff of yards, runoff from golf courses. So people fertilize their lawn when it rains. Some of that runs off. Most of our agricultural operations don't have nutrient control in place. It's pretty rare. So essentially, we're just not addressing the problem. Period. We're just not doing anything. So figuring out where to start is really pretty easy because we don't do anything. So what we can do? So we can encourage phosphorus removal at municipal water plants. There are currently available technologies, been around for a long time, easy to implement, but it costs money. It costs millions. But can be done. One thing we do a really bad job is monitoring our lakes. So Grand Lake is the most monitored lake in Oklahoma, hands down. Most of our lakes are never monitored ever for anything at all. They're never looked at.
Dr.
We don't know if they have a
Lynch,
problem.
Dr. Lynch, did you say Grand Lake is the less?
No, it's probably the most monitored.
Most monitored, thanks.
Yeah. It's very well monitored. It's the only lake that has an ecos. It's got a lab that's devoted for the lake, so that's pretty extraordinary. Most of our lakes are not looked at ever. There's never a water sample ever drawn from them to look at. So, got to start there. We got to know whether we have a problem or not. So it's hard to manage it if we don't know their condition. Another step we can do, we quit using phosphate-containing dish detergents. So some dish detergents contain a lot of phosphate. There are alternatives available. Used to be laundry soap had lots of phosphate in there. We took that out. As far as I know, everyone's clothes look just as clean as before. So I think we could probably take this out of dish soap. So again, that goes into septic tanks, municipal sewers. So a lot of the phosphorus in municipal sewers comes from the soaps we use. So I hate to use the word ban. Kind of a tough thing to enforce. Have soap cops coming around. But it's been done. Places have banned certain kinds of soaps, but probably better to get the industry involved and get them to voluntarily not do this anymore. Okay, so we could encourage implementation of management control for farms. So working through soil conservation or natural resource conservation service, we call it now, to work with farmers to identify practices that reduce nutrient levels. Those are usually pretty cheap and can be very effective. Let's see, we can encourage nutrient management plans for urban runoff. So lawns are a major source of nutrients. So cities can do things like encourage people to test their soil before they fertilize. They may not need to fertilize. There are ways to do this. There are ways to control urban runoff to try to get some of the nutrients out. So what Laurel mentioned was developing what's called a total maximum daily load for lakes. And this is a kind of an engineering exercise that I talked about a little in the beginning of the presentation, which is where you figure out just how much nutrient a lake can handle. That's your first step. First you inventory where it's all coming from. So I showed you there's like 3,000 something kilograms per day. But where's that coming from? So you identify all the sources, and then you say, and you look at the lake and say, how much can the lake stand? Well, the lake can stand, let's say 2,000. Well, we got to get rid of 1,000. How do we get rid of it? And then you identify where you get the most bang for your buck. So maybe farms may be the biggest source. Maybe that's where you address it. Maybe municipalities are the biggest sources. In some cases, what municipalities have done is said, it'll cost us $20 million to remove the phosphorus. We could take $10 million and give it to farmers. They can fix their problem, and we'll be the same place. It'll cost half as much money. So it allows you to focus where you got the problem. But it takes some money to do these studies. There has not been one of these done on Grand Lake. You got to do that kind of study. There are practically no lakes that this has been done. But it's not a difficult thing to do. It takes a year or so to do. So to do TMDL, you got to do you have to inventory sources. What are their relative contribution? The indented bullet there. How much nutrient can a lake stand? We have no idea for Grand Lake. Nobody can tell you. I mean, I can guess, but I could just pull a number out of the sky. So we don't know. So that's where you really got to start. How much can it stand and not turn pea green in the summer? And so those numbers can be developed and calculated with pretty good accuracy. So again, it allows us to focus on where the biggest problem is, what's the most cost effective. We can look at trade-offs between rural sources versus urban sources, and then marshal our money against the biggest problem. So it's better than kind of let's go fix everything, because we can't fix everything. We don't have the money. We may fix the wrong thing that really didn't have a big effect. So another very important thing that you can do, this is the most important thing you can do, is when the water looks like this, don't get in it. And tell your friends not to get in it, and tell your friends not to get in it, and tell your friends don't let their dogs in it. So if you go to the lake and the water looks like this, don't get in it. If you see people there with their kids getting in, and tell them to get their kids out of it. When the water looks like this, you get in it, you get a mouthful of it, you are very likely to become ill. Now that could be you get a tummy ache and you feel crappy for a few hours, so what? But there are other people who end up in the hospital, and so you don't want to be in that situation. So just avoid it. When it gets like this, stay out. And I hope that message gets out to, some people don't agree with that. There are some lawmakers in the state that think that's a terrible approach. You should not tell people, should not put up signs, should not tell people when the water looks like that. It's every man for himself. So I'm going to stop there. I've got other things that I can show you, but I think that's probably enough. If I could encourage you to do anything, if you talk to lawmakers, tell them the state needs to put some resources towards measuring and monitoring what's going on in our lakes. Here, have a question? That's mostly work that I did. Yeah, it's my own work. So most lakes, again, are never looked at. So we don't know. So a lake manager might call and say, well, the lake looks really green. I wonder, and if the state has the money at the time, they might take a sample. But for the most part, those kind of programs, monitoring programs, have pretty much vaporized in our economic climate. So I'm all for tax cuts, but when you cut taxes, you cut services, and this is the kind of service that gets cut. So we just don't do environmental monitoring much anymore. So there are some, we have a Blue Thumb organizations in Oklahoma, so there are citizen groups that do monitoring. Grand Lake has one. There's some other lakes that have them. They can measure for these nutrients, and they have data. And if you go to the lawmaker and say, my lake's bad, we need to do something, they may listen, they may not. If you have numbers, that's a lot more helpful. So I would encourage them to get those kind of numbers. So testing for nitrogen and phosphorus is pretty easy to do with kits. It doesn't take sophisticated technology. Measuring toxins, you can't do that. That's pretty expensive. So one toxin test costs about $250. So it adds up really quickly. Identifying things in a microscope is pretty hard to, not something that most people can do. But yeah, monitoring citizen groups is a cheap way to do it. So lakes where people live around it and want to do it. I think that is done through the State Conservation Commission and the Water Resources Board, with two groups that encourage lake monitoring. So if there's a group that wants to do that, they can contact them. They can at least get some oversight as to here's how to do it, here's how to take quality samples. They teach them how to run the kits, how to record data, keep records. So those can be very helpful, and especially in the lack of measurements anybody else is making. Okay, I'll stop there.